My name is Wendy Foster. I am 33 years old. 7 weeks before my wedding, my father stood in my kitchen and told me that he and my mom would not be coming, that my whole family would boycott it to teach me humility. He said it like it was a gift he'd wrapped himself. I didn't beg, I didn't cry. I said, okay. Then I watched his truck pull out of my driveway, and I went back to folding napkins at my kitchen table while the coffee went cold. For 33 years, I'd been the daughter who moved, who yielded, who made herself smaller so the room could stay comfortable. This was the first time I didn't. But the thing my husband stood up and did at the reception in front of 200 guests with the band frozen and the doors still open is the part my father will never forgive me for. I'm a hospice nurse. I've sat with more dying people than most folks meet in a lifetime, and I can tell you the same thing comes up at the end over and over. Nobody says they wish they'd kept the peace more. They say they wish they'd stopped waiting for permission. I know how that sounds coming from me because keeping the peace was basically my whole personality. I was the one the family called. Car broke down at midnight, call Wendy. Somebody needed a ride to chemo, call Wendy. I paid for things quietly and never mentioned it because mentioning it felt like sending a bill. And you don't bill people you love. That was the rule I'd built my life on. Give and don't count. Then Daniel came along and broke my whole system. He's a cabinet maker. He builds things that are supposed to last 100 years, and he looks at people the same way like he's checking for the joint that'll fail under load. He proposed in our kitchen with sawdust still on his forearms. No speech, just a ring and a question and a patience I didn't know what to do with. When I said yes, he didn't cheer. He just exhaled like he'd been holding it. We booked a hall by the lake and started a guest list. It climbed to 200 names before I stopped adding, 200 people who'd watched me get married. And out of all of them, the only 2 names that made my stomach tighten were the 2 at the very top of the list. Mom and Dad. I told myself that tightness was just wedding nerves. It wasn't. It was 33 years of experience warning me. To understand my family, you have to understand the ledger nobody ever wrote down but everybody balanced by. In my family, my sister Sloane needed things and I wanted things. And in our house, those were governed by completely different rules. Sloane needed a gap year, so my parents remortgaged. I wanted community college, so I paid for it myself and was praised for being independent. It took me years to notice the trick in that praise. When you're always the one who can manage, managing becomes your job, and nobody ever asks if you're tired. We were at Sunday dinner when the pattern showed itself again, clean as a fracture on an X-ray. Sloane was talking about a business she was launching, wellness retreats, the kind with singing bowls and a wait list. My dad sat at the head of the table the way he always did, nodding, the family's judge and its weather. When I mentioned the wedding date, he set down his fork. Don't make it a whole production, he said. The best thing a person can carry through life is a little humility. He said it gently, he always said it gently. That was the thing about my father, he could hand you a knife and make you feel grateful for the handle. My mom passed the potatoes and smiled at nobody. Sloane laughed and said weddings were basically expensive parties for insecure people. And everyone chuckled and I chuckled too because that was my role. I was the good sport. Here's the thing I never told anyone, not even Daniel, not for a long time. I had a picture in my head. October 12th, the lake gone gold with fall and my dad's arm under my hand as he walked me down the aisle. It was almost embarrassing how much I wanted it. I'd spent my whole life not asking for things, and this was the one thing I'd let myself want out loud. We picked the 12th because the lake turns that week, and because it was my grandmother's birthday. She was the one person who'd ever told me I didn't have to earn my seat at the table. She died when I was 19. I wanted her date. So I booked the hall and I put down the deposit, and I let myself imagine 200 people watching my father give me away like I was something precious he'd kept safe. That was the stake, though I couldn't have said it then. Not the flowers, not the dress. Belonging, the proof in front of the whole town that I was loved for existing and not just for being useful. My mom called that week and she was warm, genuinely warm, asking about colours and cake. For a few days it felt like it might actually happen, like the ledger might, just this once, land in my favour. Then she said almost as an afterthought, oh, and Sloane's got some news about the retreat. She wants to tell you herself. There was a tone under it I recognised. The tone of someone setting a table for a conversation you haven't agreed to have. I said that was nice. I hung up and I looked at the calendar on my fridge at the little circle I'd drawn around the 12th. I should have drawn it darker. Sloane called me 2 days later and she led with love the way she always did before she asked for something big. She told me she missed me. She told me she was proud of me. Then she told me she'd booked her very first retreat cohort in Bali, a full group, deposits paid, the whole launch of her business for the weekend of October 12th. The exact weekend. My weekend. So here's what I'm thinking, she said, bright and breathless. You move yours a couple weeks, it's just a party, right? Mine's a whole business, it can't move, people bought flights. I sat down at my kitchen table. I asked her as evenly as I could whether she'd checked my date before she booked. There was a pause. I mean, I knew it was around then, she said. And there it was, she hadn't forgotten my date, she had priced it in. She'd looked at the calendar, seen the thing I wanted, and decided it was the cheaper thing to sacrifice because I was the one who always sacrificed. That was the math of my whole life, said out loud in a phone call. Sloane, I said, I put down deposits, I picked the 12th on purpose. She sighed like I was being difficult. You always do this, you make everything so heavy. And then she said the part that told me my parents were already in the room with her on her side before it even hung up. Mom and Dad think it's the mature thing, they're kind of surprised you're pushing back. Kind of surprised, 3 little words. And I understood that the conversation I hadn't agreed to have was already over and I'd already lost. I want to be clear that I did not slam a door and stomp off. I'm not built that way, and honestly at that point, I still thought this was a problem you could solve if you were reasonable enough. So I got reasonable. I called Sloane back the next morning. I offered to help her find another launch weekend. I even looked up the retreat center's calendar and found 3 open dates in November. I offered to fly out to a later cohort myself on my own dime to support her. I offered to move the honeymoon and keep the wedding so nobody had to choose. I laid it all out, calm and warm, the way I'd de-escalate a frightened family in a hospital hallway. Every single option she waved away. November wouldn't work for her energy. A later cohort wasn't the launch. The wedding was the thing that had to bend because in her mind, it was always going to be the thing that bent. That's when I understood the shape of it. This was never a scheduling conflict. A scheduling conflict has solutions and I'd just handed her 5. This was a loyalty test, and the only passing answer was for me to disappear a little, one more time, so the family could feel like itself. You're really not going to move it, she finally said, and she sounded almost fascinated, like she was watching an animal do something out of character. No, I said, I'm really not. I felt strange saying it, light and sick at the same time, like the first step off a high dive. I hung up and stood in my kitchen and waited for the phone to ring again. It didn't ring that night. My father, it turned out, preferred to wait until Tuesday. My dad doesn't do angry. That's what makes him hard to fight. Angry you can push against. My father comes at you disappointed, which is a thing you can only absorb. He called on a Tuesday evening and his voice was low and warm and terribly patient, and he told me he'd been thinking about me a lot. You've always been our steady one, he said. That's why this is hard to watch. I gripped the edge of the counter. He walked me through it like a man explaining gravity to a child. Sloane was building something. Sloane was fragile in ways I wasn't. A wedding was a lovely thing, but it was at the end of the day one day and family was every day. All we're asking, he said, is that you show a little grace, move the date. Apologize to your sister for making her feel guilty. It's called humility, Wendy. It's the thing that's held this family together for 40 years. I stood there and I felt the whole gravity of him, the thing that had shaped every choice I'd ever made. Part of me, the oldest part, the 19-year-old part, wanted to say yes just to make the warmth in his voice stay. But I heard myself say something else. I don't think it's humility you're describing, Dad. Silence. I'd never once talked back to that voice. I think it's just me being quiet, I said, and you calling it a virtue. He let the silence sit the way he did when he wanted you to feel the size of your mistake. Sleep on it, he said finally, gentle as ever. You'll see it differently in the morning. I didn't. I saw it exactly the same. That I'm learning is what growing up actually feels like. I lay awake that night doing the thing I do best, which is turning a problem over until I find the angle where it's my fault. And somewhere around 2 in the morning I finally saw it clearly. And it wasn't my fault at all. This was never about a Saturday in October. If it were about the calendar, my 5 compromises would have ended it. It was about who yields. In my family there had always been a person whose job was to absorb the cost so everyone else could have what they wanted. And that person was me. And it had been me so long that everyone, including me, had stopped seeing it as a choice. It was just physics. Water runs downhill. Wendy moves. If I moved this date, I wouldn't be solving a problem. I'd be signing the contract again for the rest of my life in front of the one person I was marrying. Daniel would learn on the very first big test that his wife could be moved. And more than that, my future kids, if we had them, would grow up watching their mother fold, and they'd learn the same lesson I did, that love is a thing you earn by taking up less space. I got up and drank a glass of water in the dark kitchen. I looked at the calendar circle again and I made a quiet decision that didn't feel dramatic at all, which is how the biggest decisions usually feel. I was keeping the date, not to win, not to punish anyone, just to stop being the family's shock absorber. I went back to bed, and for the first time in a week I slept. I didn't know yet what keeping it would cost me. Keeping the date, it turned out, was not the end of the fight, it was the starting gun. Over the next 2 weeks my family did the thing families like mine do best. They didn't yell, they organized. My aunt called to tell me she was worried about me, which is what my family says when they mean they're disappointed in you. A cousin I hadn't spoken to in a year messaged to say she hoped I wasn't letting a date come between me and blood. My mom called every couple of days, and each call started with cake and ended with a soft, tearful, "I just wish you'd think about your sister." The message was always the same, sanded smooth so it wouldn't look like what it was. "Fold, we miss the version of you that folds." It's a strange thing being the target of a kindness campaign designed to erase you. Every voice was gentle. Every word was concern. And underneath all of it was one instruction repeated in a dozen loving accents. Make yourself small again and we'll make all this discomfort go away. I started letting the calls go to voicemail, not out of spite, out of survival. I'd sit at the table with Daniel after a shift, listening to my mother's voice fill our kitchen with sweetness and guilt, and he'd just quietly reach over and take my hand until it stopped. He never told me what to do. He just made sure I wasn't alone while I did it. The part that finally hardened something in me came by accident, the way the worst truths usually do. Sloane, flustered and venting, let it slip on a call that our parents had given her $22,000 to seed the retreat business. $22,000 for the launch, for the singing bowls and the deposits and the Bali villa. She couldn't reschedule. I remember I actually laughed, one short surprised sound, because the math was so clean it was almost funny. These were the same people who'd called my wedding just a party and told me not to make it a whole production. The same father who'd lectured me about humility, about not needing much, about the grace of carrying less. He'd written a check for $22,000 so my sister could fly a group of strangers to an island, and in the same breath asked me to give up the one day I'd ever asked for. I want to be careful here because I know how this sounds, like I'm keeping score. I wasn't. That was the whole tragedy of it. I'd never once kept score. And they had counted on that. The ledger only works if one person refuses to read it, and I'd just read it. I sat with that number for a long time, not with rage exactly, with something quieter and more permanent, like a light coming on in a room you'd lived in your whole life in the dark. Humility wasn't a family value, it was a budget. It was the line item they'd spent my entire life spending because it cost them nothing and it cost me everything. And I had let them because I loved them, and I thought that's what love was. I told Daniel a story that night I'd never told anyone. When I was 10, I'd been cast as the lead in the school play. The one time in my childhood I got to stand in the center of something. 2 days before opening night, Sloane, who was 6, spiked a fever the doctor couldn't explain. My parents decided the whole family should stay home with her, and they decided I should skip the play so Sloane wouldn't feel left out when she was better. I remember standing in my costume in the kitchen, already dressed, and my father crouching down to my level with that same warm, patient face. "Your sister needs us," he said. "That's what a family does. The bigger person is the one who understands." I was 10 and I wanted so badly to be the bigger person. So I took off the costume and I hung it up and I stayed home and I held my sister's hand, and I never told anyone that something in me had folded shut that night and stayed shut. Sloane's fever broke the next morning. Turned out to be nothing. Nobody ever mentioned the play again. Daniel didn't say anything for a while after I finished. Then he said quietly, "You were 10, like that settled something, like a 10-year-old should never have been handed that bill. And I realized I'd been carrying that costume my whole life, putting it on, taking it off, hanging it up again and again. Every single time the family needed the bigger person and looked at me. 33 years of being the bigger person had a very specific cost. It was that I had somehow gotten very, very small, and I was so tired of it. I was tired all the way down to the bone. The ultimatum came 7 weeks before the wedding, and it came, of course, from my father. He didn't call this time. He drove the 2 hours up to our lake town and knocked on my door on a Sunday afternoon, and I let him in, and I made him coffee because even then, even knowing what was coming, I couldn't stop being his daughter. He sat at my kitchen table, the same table where Daniel had told me I owed no one a smaller life, and he folded his hands and he laid it out. "I've talked to your mother," he said, "and to your sister, and we've come to a decision as a family. I already knew, you always know with my father right before he says it. If you keep this date," he said, slow and sad and certain, "none of us will be there, not me, not your mother, not your sister, not your aunts, we won't attend." He let that land, then he delivered the line I'll hear for the rest of my life. "Sometimes the only way to teach someone humility," he said, "is to let them feel what it's like to stand alone." I didn't beg. I want you to know that because the old me would have followed him out to the car, would have knelt down at the passenger window where my mother sat, would have promised anything to make the warmth come back. I didn't do that. I walked my father to the door and I said, "I understand your decision and I'm keeping mine." My voice didn't shake. That surprised me more than anything. And I didn't cry, not while he was there, not while I watched his truck pull out of my driveway and turn back toward the highway with my mother, a small, still shape in the front seat. I stood at my own window and I watched them go. And I felt something I didn't have a word for yet. It wasn't triumph. God, it wasn't triumph. It was more like the feeling after you set a broken bone. A clean, bright, sickening pain that you know is the beginning of healing but hurts exactly as much as the break. When Daniel got home from the shop, I finally let go and he held me at the kitchen table while I came apart. And he didn't tell me I'd done the right thing. And he didn't tell me it would be okay. He just held on. Later, when I could breathe again, I told him the worst part. It wasn't that they weren't coming. It was that some stupid, loyal 10-year-old part of me had truly believed, right up until my father said the words out loud, that they would. That when it came down to it, they'd choose me. "They chose the lesson," I said. And Daniel said the truest thing anyone said to me that whole year. "No," he said, "they chose being comfortable, they just call it a lesson." The night before the wedding, my father made his last move. He called at 9, and I stepped out onto our porch to take it because I didn't want his voice in the house on that particular night. He sounded almost kind. "I've been thinking," he said, "I don't want to miss my daughter's wedding, I really don't." For one dizzy second, hope again, that stubborn animal, then he kept going. "So here's what we'll do. In the morning you call your sister and you apologize and you tell everyone the honeymoon's postponed, that you'll fly out to support her retreat. You show the family a little humility. Do that and I'll be there tomorrow. I'll walk you down that aisle myself." There it was, the thing I'd wanted most in the world. My father's arm under my hand, offered at the only price he ever charged. Make yourself small and you can have the love. Pay the tax and the seat is yours. I stood on my porch in the cold and I looked out at the dark lake and I understood that this was the whole thing, the entire lesson of my life distilled into one phone call. He wasn't offering me my father. He was offering me a rental. My father's presence, at least for the length of my obedience, repossessed the second I stood up straight again. "Dad," I said, and my voice was so steady it scared me. "I would give almost anything to have you walk me down that aisle. I need you to know that." I heard him start to say something satisfied. "But not that," I said. "Not an apology I don't owe for wanting one day that was mine." "Silence, then you've made your choice," he said, cold now, the warmth finally gone. "I've made mine," I agreed, and I hung up. And I sat down on the cold porch step and I let the old life end. There was no taking it back after that. I didn't want to. The morning of October 12th came up gold over the lake, exactly the way I'd pictured it. My whole life, which felt almost like a cruelty and then slowly like a gift. When it came time to line up, there was the question nobody wanted to ask. "Who walks you?" The wedding coordinator hovered and I felt the old grief rise up. The picture of my father's arm dissolving. Then Ruth stepped up. Ruth is a hospice nurse who trained me when I first started, a decade ago, 70 now. Tough as a boot, a woman who has walked more people to the end of their lives than anyone I know. She took my arm without being asked. "I've walked a lot of people through the hardest doors of their lives," she said, dry as anything. "Never done a happy one, let's go." And I laughed and the grief loosened its grip just enough. Because here's what I realized, standing in that doorway on Ruth's arm. I'd spent months mourning the people who wouldn't come, and I'd almost missed the ones who would. The room past those doors was full of people who'd chosen me. Not because I was useful, not because I'd folded, but just because I was theirs. My father wanted me to feel what it was like to stand alone. Standing in that doorway, I have never felt less alone in my life. The reception was the kind of warm chaos that makes a hall feel like a living thing. 200 people who actually wanted to be there, settling in at their tables. Daniel and I took our seats at the head table, and there, right beside us, sat 2 empty chairs. Little cream cards in careful calligraphy in front of 2 chairs nobody would fill. Mr. and Mrs. Ray Foster. My father and I haven't spoken since. I won't pretend that doesn't hurt because it does. On ordinary Tuesdays in the frozen aisle at the grocery store, I'll see a grey-haired man in a work jacket and forget for half a second. But the grip it had on me is gone. I sat with a dying man last week who told me the only regret he had left was all the times he made himself smaller for people who never once made room for him. And I thought about my father, and I understood at last that real humility was never about disappearing so everyone else could be comfortable. It's about knowing exactly what you're worth and refusing gently to accept a single penny less. That's my story. 1 date on a calendar, 2 empty chairs, and a word I finally handed back.